Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. We're actually going to be talking about the patch as well, and cards, and just a lot of different stuff. The draft preview for the new set Empire of Glass is out, so there are a pile of cards to go through. We're also going to talk about the current balance changes that have just been made to prep for Empire of Glass, and we're going to discuss the new mechanic, Valkyrie Warp, or just the monster warp in general, which I assume will be a thing from now on in other sets as well, but should be particularly interesting in this one, of course, because we're going to be dealing with Valkyrie Warp. Okay, so yeah, let's get into it. There is a lot of different stuff happening, and yeah, we're going to get into basically each part of it as we talk about different sets. So first things first, let's go into the balance changes, then we'll talk about Valkyrie Warp, and then after that we can go into the draft cards and the spoiler cards that have been spoiled so far, which are all collected in a handy dandy document that will be linked in the little doobly-doo below. So yeah, first things first, the Empire of Glass balance changes. There are a bunch of different changes going on. Currently, there is a single nerf to the Throne format, which is Ice Elemental. It has gone from a 3-1 to a 2-1 from the Emblem of Linray. So if you transmute, you'll get a 2-1 Aegis instead of a 3-1 Aegis, which is pretty big deal. Basically means that you don't really have a Snowcrest Yeti option at, I believe it's 3 power, or it's 3 influence technically, but with primal symbols and primal sigils, does mean that Skycrag aggro has lost another fairly aggressive tool. I think Snowcrest Yeti actually went back up to 2-1 a while ago, so yeah, Skycrag aggro is probably not in terrible shape here, but it does mean they lose a fairly aggressive option as far as just general Aegis options go. This is not something that I'm particularly worried about, but does potentially affect the format, so be aware of it. And yeah, it's specifically because of the nerf to Blightmoth, as they have said. All right, other things that have been happening, there are new promo cards. The newest promo card was released this week. We'll be talking about that, I think, with the spoilers and possibly right now with the just general promo stuff. But yeah, we'll discuss that in just a little bit. So there's going to be a promo every week for the month, and the current one is one that I've actually forgotten about, so I'm going to go check on it real quick. Because we prepped everything and then we forgot that the new promo card was here. Yeah, the new promo card is Scrapbind Skimmer. It's a flying regen that has summon, look at the top 8 cards of your deck and choose one to put on top of your deck and then discard the rest. It's a 6-cost 4/4. So notably, it's a pretty good card in blue where you can grab something and sort of pick it up. You can pick a particular card that you want to be playing on the next turn while playing a pretty damage resistant flyer, all of which are really, really good things in a draft environment, but since this is a promo card, it's never going to be in the draft landscape. So this is something that I would expect to be really strong in a limited format. In Expedition, it seems like it'll be okay. Throne wise, I would say that the tutor effect is probably strong enough, considering that the unit is actually relevantly capable of holding the fort for at least one turn against large units, and also a decent flyer that has some closeout potential. All of those are things that you want in control. You want tutoring, you want card draw, although this is not technically card draw, you want card selection, and you want the ability to stall out the game a little bit longer. I think it's a little bit weak in Throne, but I think in Expedition it's perfectly fine, and it would have been a bomb card in draft, but we're not going to be seeing it there. So all right, let's get into the overall buffs and changes. So a few buffs announced aimed at the upcoming Empire of Glass draft formats. Frostbite Chrysalis now says when you play an attachment instead of when you play a relic, stun an enemy unit. So was a 4/6 play a relic stun, now when you play any attachment, you get to stun the enemy unit. This makes this a really powerful uncommon. It's just already was a decent card in a relic heavy set to make stuns happen, but now it is something where you can basically put any weapon on it and it'll automatically stun the enemy unit, and it'll do it over and over and over again, akin to cards like Civic Peacekeeper and other stuff in that sort of format. There's a 3/3 that used to have this ability as an ultimate. There hasn't been one that has specifically done this whenever you play any attachment. So this is something that makes weapons and general sort of like just value plays with like Voltrons to be really, really powerful. It's something that you can get a lot of value out of in a very short period of time. So it's going to be something that's pretty worth seeing if you can get that that kind of setup happening. Wind Cloak, pay 4 to give a unit flying this turn instead of one of your units flying this turn. This gives Wind Cloak the ability to pop Aegises, which is pretty handy. Can also toss things up into the air to destroy them with Violent Gust or Aerial Battle. Not sure if either of those are going to be cards in the format, but if you're in a draft format, this might be a card that you're going to be looking at as an option. Mighty Strikes, now Amplify 2 as opposed to Amplify 3. I think this is a rebuff to the card. I can't remember what it was before. It might have been a 2 cost with Amplify 3. Now it's a 3 cost with Amplify 2, or maybe it's the other way around and it's actually just gone back to its original format. Either way, Mighty Strikes is a super powerful card, and this is a very, very good draft card that's going to be seeing a lot of play, I would expect. I would also expect it to see play in Expedition, so it should be very, very strong. Mask Maker, now 3 cost, was 4 cost. It's a 3/3 that gives +1/+1 to other units, meaning that it is very, very good with tribal types. This makes Mask Maker an extremely powerful option. 3 cost 3/3 is very, very good in draft. Like, as a rare, this will just enforce basically any tribal that you want. I would also say that this card could see play in Throne Expedition, basically anywhere. Like, if you wanted to do Skycrag Yetis with Mask Maker, or just Rakano Valks, or like any number of other like options, Grenadin is a very likely option. A 3/3 for 3 that gives +1/+1 to every other unit type is insanely powerful. This is a bomb rare now, and it's actually something that can see play basically anywhere. So yeah, Mask Maker getting a lot of value. He always seemed to have like a connection with strangers, but they never changed him to a stranger. He just stayed a cultist, so I guess he's just a Mask Maker. Yeah, all right. The Inner Fire cycle from the Dusk Roads are essentially Amplify cards, but were made before the mechanics debut. With the mechanics return as a major mechanic in Empire of Glass, we're updating this cycle to use the Amplify UI, and if you are getting the buff to their cost as well. So Inner Fire basically now has Amplify 1, Exhaust to Grenadin, and all of the other ones say similar things. Instead of you may pay an Exhaust to play additionals over and over and over again, it just says Amplify, Exhaust, do the thing, which isn't a functional change, but does mean that these cards have been changed in some ways, and also they might be made a little bit cheaper in certain areas. For example, Inner Fire now exhausts for even more Infernuses for more Amplifies. This makes it a disgusting card in draft, because basically as long as you have 4 Grenadins, you can generate 25 damage at 9, which is a pretty big deal. That's a lot of Infernuses. 5 Infernuses is a very, very big deal as a closer in a Grenadin format. Like, this is something that should be paid attention to. If it is in draft, it's going to be absolutely bonkers shenanigans. And honestly, we might see some sort of interesting ramp Inner Fire shenanigans as well in an Expedition format. Hard to say exactly where it's going to be, but definitely an interesting change. Stirring Sand stays exactly the same, which is fine. That was generally the most powerful of the cycle. Curfew Enforcement has gone from 2 cost to 1 cost, and the Amplify has also gone from 2 cost to 1 cost. Curfew Enforcement was the weakest of the different spells, but it was one that like never made it there for a lot of different reasons, part of which was that there wasn't very strong Valkyrie support. The new set is extremely Valkyrie heavy and is going to have Valkyrie Warp in particular, so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in the future, but basically there's a lot of Valkyries, so bringing this card down this much is pretty interesting. Since this is a permanent -1 bonus to basically everything, this is a way for Valkyrie to just shut off an entire board and make sure it stays shut off for a pretty long time. Like, this potentially effectively removes cards from the board for a period of time that is just going to be like very hard to deal with. Like, if you can stick enough weapons on something that has been heavily curfew enforcemented, then like maybe you are going to get something that's going to have value again, but more likely this card is going to be like game ending, one-sided, just nonsense. I am curious if this is not going to be too powerful. It's not a card that like usually is in that area, seeing as it still leaves all the cards behind, but yeah, this definitely like wipes the attack power off of just everything on the board at the cost of basically exhausting your Valkyries, which is not too bad of a cost overall. Snow Pelting, same thing, I believe. Amplify 2, yep, exactly the same. Deadly Confrontation now costs 1 each. Deadly Confrontation was another one that I thought was a really, really strong limited choice. Costing 1 less for the Amplify is pretty cool. I don't know that Unseen are a tribe in the new format, but this is still something that can definitely be probably a pretty big upgrade in terms of buffs. Like, you can kill a lot of stuff with this now. There's a bunch of unit type updates. Mostly a lot of things are getting the soldier type, including Albin Roa, Albin Fallen, Omri Dragonbane, All Head Ascending, all of that. I noticed, I went down the list overall, like, you just see a lot of different things getting soldier, including like Champion of Progress and just various cards. Like Yetis are getting rogue types. There are a bunch of cards that are getting explorers again. The Titan created by Call of the Ancients is now a Mandrake, which I guess that's an interesting change overall. And the other one that I didn't really love was that a Ren Traditionalist is now a Mage Soldier, which kind of makes sense, but Ren Traditionalist is just like a relic happy 5/5, so being a soldier is not like really benefiting Ren one way or the other. It works for tribal mechanics. It just seems like an odd flavor hit to me. Overall, this is just, you know, a lot of extra tribal stuff, and it really makes soldiers like a very big change. Like, there's going to be a lot of different soldiers in Throne that are going to be synergizing with the new soldier abilities that are happening in the format, so that's going to be a pretty big deal. And they also spoiled Skimmer Wrangler here, which we'll talk about as well. We can talk about it here. It's a 3-cost 4/3 with Overwhelm that says summon, stun an enemy unit while with flying. It stays stunned while you have Skimmer Wrangler. So it is essentially an Ice Sprite for flyers that is actually huge, which yeah, kind of neat. And it functions as a soldier, which means that you get to lock something down with flying and then kill it later with any of the other cards that basically kill stunned units when you have soldiers. There are several of those. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Very, very cool overall. Okay, so next up, we have to talk about Valkyrie Warp. That is the new mechanic that is coming out. Let's go ahead and find an example of a Valkyrie Warp card. We have the entire spoiler list in front of us. So here is one. Deathwing, flying deadly lifesteal. Valkyrie Warp, the top weapon out of your deck, gets deadly and lifesteal. So basically, what this says is... Honestly, I think I have to look it up again. I do remember the rules to it, but I think I'm going to check it one more time just to be totally sure, because I don't want to get this wrong for the YouTube video. So we're going to just open up that article and we can just talk about it. If you have a Valkyrie in play, you can warp cards with Valkyrie Warp and get a bonus when you play them. So any card that actually has Valkyrie Warp can be warped, but only if you have a Valkyrie in play. And yeah, I am glad I looked that up, because I think I was going to muddle the explanation of that just a little bit. So yeah, Deathwing is a flying deadly lifesteal, and then if you have a Valkyrie in play, you get to warp it off the top of your deck. When you do that, you also get a bonus effect, which means that basically if this card is on top of your deck and you have a Valkyrie in play, you can see it, and you can play it, and then the top weapon of your deck gets deadly and lifesteal in addition to that. Valkyrie synergize really well with weapons in this format, so this is something that's going to be like pretty common, is seeing a lot of like weapon-based effects. This is a card that has quite a lot of different text on it, but flying deadly and lifesteal together definitely makes for a pretty convincing argument that you should probably be playing it. Unseen Commando was the other 2/3, I think, recently, with like lifesteal and flying that was just like very, very strong in this format, but a deadly flyer is also really good. This doesn't attack for as much pressure as Unseen Commando, but the weapon ability of deadly and lifesteal on the weapon is also really handy, so I think it kind of balances out. Yeah, the Valkyrie Warp ability is pretty interesting. I think that basically like unit warp is likely something that we're going to be seeing fairly commonly in further sets. It's not just going to be Valkyries. We're going to see Grenadin Warp, we're going to see Soldier Warp, we're going to see all kinds of warp, but maybe not in this set specifically, because they're specifically sort of touting it as being Valkyrie Warp. So yeah, this is something that allows you to play more warp cards under different conditions. It means that you don't have a sort of critical mass of warp cards where you reach so many warp cards that people's decks just become nothing but warp cards. So you have a way to sort of like restrict warp cards and still print warp cards while like enforcing some cool tribal stuff, basically allowing it just opens up design space to explore and experiment and play with warp, which is just a really, really good mechanic that Eternal happens to like flow around. So I think it's a little wordy and a little bit difficult to explain overall as far as the like general like setup of it goes. Like, Valkyrie Warp is clearly like a pretty cool mechanic, but it also doesn't like feel great to say off the tongue. Other than that, I actually think it's like a pretty interesting way to sort of implement Warp in further sets without getting too crazy with Throne. Seems like a really cool way to move that along, and like, yeah, Valkyries with Warp is gonna be a lot of fun. Like, generally Warp is just a really strong setup. I'm interested to see if this is going to reach a power level where these cards are going to be getting to see a lot of warps, or whether it's going to be something that like goes the way of Mentor and you don't see quite as much of it. I'm pretty sure that they're going to get the balance right on this overall, but like, this is definitely something where we might not see as many warps because you have to actually stick a Valkyrie and keep a Valkyrie on the board, which is not always easy to do, especially in like the more removal heavy formats. So yeah, I think it's a very cool mechanic, and I think that Warp is just like a really fun mechanic, so bringing it back is a great plan. This is a good way to do it without basically breaking Throne, so seems like a solid route to go for me. All right, that is the initial breakdown. The next part of this is probably going to take a little bit, so buckle in. We're going to go over each of the spoilers that have been spoiled so far, barring all the ones that we've already reviewed. So we're just going to talk about everything that's happened. The draft preview is out right now, so we have a lot of spoilers to go through. I'm hoping that this particular sheet is up to date, because I considered trying to collect them all and then also do the draft spoilers, but I realized that I would probably go insane, so we're going to just use spoiler.soulforgeladder.com. You can check that out as well. It'll be in a link in the description below. But yeah, we're going to go over each card and talk about their power level in Draft, Expedition, and Throne. Limited Expedition and Throne, I guess, and Sealed and Draft tend to sort of overlap. And then we're going to discuss, you know, like what kind of decks you can build with it, what the overall power level is, and just sort of like, you know, what we think about the lore and the art of the card overall. So yeah, let's get into it, starting with Shadowcreeper. Shadowcreeper, nothing can have an Aegis at a 2-cost 3/1. That's a decently powerful effect. Ultimate, pay 5 and discard a card to kill an enemy unit. That's also a decently powerful effect. This is a 3/1 that A, turns off Aegis, which is something that Shadow decks really have a problems dealing with, and B, turns any power card or card that you don't want into a removal spell, i.e. Death Strike, as long as you can keep the Shadowcreeper out on the board. At 7, it's a removal card that seems pretty reasonable. At like 2, it's a 3/1, which trades with most units, and it also shuts off a bunch of Aegises, which makes it easier to deal with Yetis and a bunch of other things. Yeah, you can play this card in Throne. It's strong enough. It's only got 1 health, but I would say that nothing can have an Aegis is a really powerful effect, and you need more than just Vara to push Aegis out of the format, so this is something that is potentially really valuable. That ultimate ability is very, very good. I think it's strong in Expedition. I think it's strong in Throne. I don't think it's like game-breaking in either of them. It's just something that you really want to have in your back pocket, or that you want to use if you are a removal-heavy deck that wants to push through Aegises. Seems really cool. In a draft format, this is a rare that you would really happy to get, because it is a removal spell on top of a 2-drop, and those are 2 things that you need in draft pretty heavily. Also, it turns off Aegis, which you don't get too many cards in draft that have Aegis, but if you're playing removal, you sure don't want your opponent's draft cards to have Aegis. So this is definitely a rare worth picking up. It just does most of the things that you want to do, except win the game, which is where the really serious bombs in draft go. Rotoscavenger, 2/1 decay. When you sacrifice another unit, Rotoscavenger gets +1/+1. If it was Granadin, Rotoscavenger deals 1 damage to an enemy. A Granadin, notably not a Granadin dog. There is a Granadin dog, so I'm not sure why this isn't a Granadin dog, but hey, there you go. Anyways, 2/1. So the 2/1 decay, that's an okay stat line. Decay is reasonable. It's not exactly super strong, but when you get the extra like sacrifice ability sort of stacking up overall, you do want this card to have the reduced health, because otherwise it becomes pretty out of control pretty fast. The 1 damage to an enemy is especially helpful since the card has decay. That includes enemy units, so every time you sack a Granadin, which you're likely to be doing quite a lot in this format, you're going to be weakening your opponent's stuff and giving your Rotoscavenger a little bit of extra oomph. I'd say this is a pretty strong draft card. You do have to build around it somewhat, but a 2/1 decay is still going to fight for itself pretty well. In Expedition, this deck seems like it's going to be reasonable in a pretty good way. Throne-wise, Grenadin have a lot of things going on right now, and I don't know that decay is really a super powerful Throne mechanic. Like, weakening things is useful, but in Throne you really need to kill things on the turn that they come out. So this is something where Throne, maybe not so much, but Expedition definitely seems like an interesting deck to build around, provided you're building sacrifice stuff with Grenadins and spell damage. There is a Grenadin that plays Snipe when it is sacrificed, which we will be talking about later. There's a bunch of new sacrifice Grenadin options, and so there's plenty of different ways for Roto Scavenger to sort of get that extra damage going. This seems like a powerful uncommon in draft, especially since the, I think, key card in Stone Scar draft is probably one of the most powerful uncommons we've seen. We'll get to that. Replication Cell. Summon, sacrifice a unit. It is a relic, of course, but when you play it, you also have to sack a unit. Pay 4 to play a copy of the sacrifice unit. Use this ability only once per turn, unless that unit is a Grenadin. Kind of interesting. You can duplicate Grenadin over and over and over again. So if you can find a way to, like, there's a couple of weird things that you can do with this. If you can find, the most common thing that I can think of is that there's gonna be an infinite turn combo with this eventually. It's gonna be something along the lines of, like, get a bunch of power, play copies of the sacrifice of a unit that allows you to, like, take an extra turn. There isn't currently one of those, but I'm just thinking that, like, oh, get a spell back maybe? That seems very likely. Yeah, yeah, that's it. If you just do it to Serpent, the Serpent that brings a card back. No, the take an extra turn card is void bound. I'm betting there's an infinite combo out there by turning a card into a Grenadin, or by just sacking a unit and constantly copying it and using it to shut your opponent down in some way. You can use Counterfeiter to turn any card into a Grenadin, which allows you to replication them multiple times. That'll be a lot of fun. And Counterfeiter happens to be in Feln, which means it matches a color with Replication Cell. So yeah, there's some pretty interesting stuff that you can do with that. This is just like a bonkers hot nonsense card in terms of, like, the copy effect. You have to pay 8 to even get the unit that you sacrificed back, so it is clearly a very slow relic and probably not a terribly powerful one. It's more of a fun of, but you can do some pretty interesting things with it, and the value options on it are quite strong. It's not quite like Quicksilver Mirror levels of strong, just because of, like, the fact that it's, like, so difficult to get everything going, and you still have to pay 4 into it every turn, but it's cheaper and faster than Quicksilver Mirror, which really makes a world of difference in a combo deck if you're trying to, like, throw a Svetja around or do something really wild with, like, just shutting off your opponent's stuff. Yeah, this card's clearly pretty interesting, and you can do a lot of different stuff with it. You can also, of course, well, you can't really sacrifice multiple copies of things to it. I'd be curious to see what would happen if you, like, teleported it back and sacrificed a different unit, whether it would imprint both units and you could play a copy of both, or, like, how exactly that would happen. Probably it'd only do whichever one you sacrificed when you summoned it, but yeah, something curious and interesting to, like, sort of figure out. Goliath Flytrap, 3/5 summon Plunder. 4 cost Plunders really don't excite me all that much, but sure. Ultimate, at the start of your turn, play Silence. So that's an interesting ultimate. It says, like, basically at the start of your turn, after playing a 3/5 for 4, you get to silence one unit, assuming that, like, that unit hasn't already, like, yeah, it kind of, like, puts some pressure on your opponent. It's an okay draft card. It's definitely not a strong card anywhere else. The Plunder ability is, like, what makes it interesting in draft. But overall, like, this is a card that, like, probably doesn't really do a lot in an Expedition or Throne format. I don't really love it in, like, draft either. This creates a puzzle for your opponent to solve, which is always something that I'd rather not do even in a draft format. It basically just means that they want to, like, not play their next big, like, sort of card that could get silenced, or they want to kill the Flytrap so that the ultimate doesn't happen. Both of those things are pretty likely, so yeah, I'm skeptical of this. This card also really looks like it has eyes, but it doesn't. I don't know what it is about the art. It just looks like it has a really cute face, and then nope, not so much. It's just a mouth. All right, Kyoju Elevator. Non-Valkyrie units in your deck have Valkyrie Warp charge, so basically, if you have a Valkyrie and you have a Kyoju Elevator, every unit in your deck has Warp, and every unit in your deck can charge. That's pretty powerful. That might be too powerful. That's really, really good. There are not that many cards that give most of the cards in your deck Warp, and this one gives every unit in your deck Warp, which the only other card that currently does that is a 5-drop that costs 5 red. this is a pretty powerful relic. I can see it being played in Throne. I can see it being played in Expedition. I can see it being played in Draft. I think it's powerful in all of them. Whether it breaks the game or not is up for debate. I would think that it's somewhat unlikely, but as a 2-cost, you could probably find a lot of interesting ways to like generate power for each attack or something along those lines, and thus get a lot more warps. You still have to, of course, clear out your spells and clear out like other stuff like that, but like with End of the Barrel and some like interesting like warp cards that are cheap and easy to use, and then just playing a Valkyrie and Kyoju Elevator, this is something that clearly has some like value as a big Valkyrie Warp card. Obviously, you can turn it off every single time that you kill the Valkyrie, so that makes a difference, but yeah, this is still a pretty strong value option that should make Valkyrie very interesting in a red-green deck or a red-purple deck or any number of like very unusual types of lists. I think this has a lot of potential. Auto Tread. Enemies lose their regen and can't regenerate. Okay, so we've got a safety valve for regen if regen gets too powerful. Pay 1 and discard a card to deal 1 damage. Auto Tread gets +1/+1. So you have to pitch cards to get the value, but honestly, like even for a tiny ping effect like that, even with a tiny buff effect like that, I think that discarding cards for value can be really handy. This is a cheap way to discard cards for any number of forced discard effects that you might want to trigger. Privilege of Rank, for example, is currently even in the like preview draft format, so there's some things that you can play around with. There are also some red cards that currently give you Praxis Outlaws. There are cards that draw when you run out of cards, so yeah, this is something where you are forcing yourself to discard in order to get some advantage, but you can do this as many times as you like, and the ability only costs 1 to play and makes your auto tread bigger. So this card could potentially win the game on its own, which is really good in a draft format, and it's very interesting in a combo deck. I don't know if it's going to be any good in a Throne format. It's just like weak and vulnerable, but it triggers pretty quickly, and like ideally there's probably some sort of combo where you can just get this card down, deal a bunch of damage to your opponent, and then like give it charge and swing with it. Like, I'm not sure exactly what that is, but I wouldn't be surprised if the discarding actually like turns into some sort of interesting combo. Obviously, this card has to be played with other cards that really support discarding, because discarding cards is generally bad, and this is a pretty bad effect if you are just doing it to like a random 2/2 twice. Like, but if you're using it to like kill a 1/1, then you're, you know, going card for card at the very least, and then you're also buffing your like decent draft common. So yeah, this is okay, or draft uncommon rather. This is okay. I wouldn't say it's amazing in a limited format, but I'm interested to see what the combos with it might end up being. Gleaming Grenadin, charge, entomb, play a 1/1 rustling with decay. It's a 1/1 with charge, and it has an entomb that gives you a rustling. So yeah, decent value. It's basically like a little bit like Grenadin, that like the Grenadin that plays a 1/1, except that both of the Grenadin in this case have abilities, which is kind of handy. And you know, you do have to entomb it to get the rustling with decay, but that's a potential like trick that you can pull where you can attack with this card, devour it the next turn, get a rustling out, kill a 2/1. Neat stuff. Overall, not an insanely powerful Grenadin, but sacrifice-heavy Grenadin that can also deal damage. That's potentially something that can see a lot of play in, I think, all 3 formats. So yeah, if you have something interesting to do with this, this is just an easy card to sacrifice that you can play at 1 that gives you a pretty relevant benefit. It's not like Dark Wisp powerful, but it's you know, one of those cards that you stack on top of Dark Wisp to make a really, really good sacrifice-based deck. Gassy Perfume, give one of your units killer and regen. Basically makes it into something that can immediately attack an enemy unit and then not take damage from doing so. There are a couple of other cards that have this sort of ability. It's reasonably powerful. As blue removal, definitely not bad. You obviously need something with a good attack to really get Gassy Perfume to work, and it is a slow spell, so, you know, that's a little tricky as well, but this seems like solid removal that you can probably play in Expedition and would be happy to play in Draft. So very, very strong in those formats. Killer is not in like low supply in Throne, so I would not expect to see this very often. Nectar of Unlife, decay, deal 2 damage, amplify 3, draw a unit from your void, it gets decay and voidbound. Okay, so you can amplify this as many times as you like to draw as many different units as you like from your void. Good amount of card draw advantage, and then it's also a 2-cost spell that kills stuff. All of that seems like it's pretty reasonable. Like, this is something that can, no, it's not quite grasping at shadows at 5, but it definitely does like make a unit kind of sticky in a way that's going to be pretty unhelpful for your opponent. Makes Destiny cards come back, allows you to like just kill something that's like you need to deal with. Overall, really flexible, good expedition card, great draft card, and like probably an adequate throne card, but I wouldn't say that it's going to be insanely strong. Darkwater Vines, regen, ultimate. Whenever any player discards a card, Darkwater Vines gets +1, and each player discards the bottom 4 cards of their deck. Notice the bottom cards instead of the top cards. There are very few cards that actually do cause you to mill from the bottom, mostly because there are things that you put on the bottom that you might actually want to, get back. This is an interesting one. It's a 1/1 that defends you pretty well, and then like also you can use it to sort of like force cards that have been forced to the bottom of your deck into your void, which is like the one place that like the bottom of your deck is sort of the place that people put cards so that they don't go into your void. So that might have some potential as like a market card in Throne. I could actually see that. Yeah, I don't know what to make of this. The ultimate overall is not like value, so it's definitely like more of a mill card, but it does do effectively like a Sporefolk type thing, and you can trigger it with Sporefolk to get an excellent amount of mill very quickly. I mean, Darkwater Vines into Sporefolk gives you straight mill. That's strong enough to be played in, I think, most forms of like Reanimator. So yeah, Throne, Expedition, extremely strong card. Draft, yeah, it's fine. A 1/1 regen is not unreasonable, so yeah, this is okay, and if you're playing with Void Recursion, you can even do that in Draft, so this is something that you can definitely pick up if you need to. And it's got regen, so it doesn't die to like Vara's Favor and a bunch of other stuff that normally kills 1/1s. 1 health cards are much more powerful with regen than they have been in any other format. That stat line, like 1 health is just generally like death as a stat line, especially in Throne, but with regen you can actually deal with it because the card can trade a lot better. Skimmer Wrangler, we talked about this one, very fun. What do we got next? Restorative Process. Draw an attachment and a sentinel from your void. So this one gives you the decent amount of card draw for 2. You have to get both an attachment and a sentinel into your void for that card to be effective, but nonetheless it's still card draw and it's still very cheap. It's also recursion and very cheap, and I'm pretty sure, I think previously with cards like this you can trigger it even if you only have 1 attachment or 1 sentinel. So even if it's like a disjunction where you're just trying to fetch back a relic in a relic sentinel deck, like that's strong enough to probably be played in a Throne, Expedition, or Draft deck. Draft-wise, you're probably not going to be playing this too much unless you're playing with like relic weapons or very big sentinels, but recursion is still pretty useful. I would say it's not an amazingly powerful card, probably like a D in Draft, but like if you get it into the right deck, it's definitely going to do some interesting stuff. The Great Kudzu, Fate, you gain 3 health. Ultimate, pay 10 to give the top 3 units of your deck +1 strength and destiny. This is a Pojo card, I suppose, huh? 7/7, it's got Fate, gain 3 health. That's actually one of my favorite things like in the world, is just free health off of cards. I love when cards give you free health. That is a really serious benefit that like, it's just like, hey, I just have more health than you, so like I now fold to aggro much less and have a different clock than everybody else. Like that's a very big deal when you're trying to play very big cards. The Great Kudzu costs 17 to activate properly, but it is a 7-cost 7/7, and its ultimate is clearly disgusting. I think it is strong enough for all 3 formats. Throne-wise, it's going to be a little bit slow. A 7/7 that doesn't do anything on the turn that it's played is not amazing, but I would say that like the Fate ability makes up for that because you can do stuff like, basically this is a crown card. You can give cards a lot of destiny in a crown deck and just constantly like play Second Sight or Twinning Ritual on the Great Kudzu to gain more and more health while also giving this card Destiny and making it so you have more copies of it, which makes it easier to play the ultimate because people are going to have a harder time killing all of the different Kudzus that you are playing. Super fun, and obviously there's a lot of different ways to discount it. There's even some cards that discount market cards in the current format, so this is a fine market card. I see this being played in Throne only a little, in Expedition quite a bit, and in Draft it's absolutely a bomb legendary, just disgusting to have and really powerful to play. Mabel Off Delete. When you amplify a card, Mabel Off Delete gets +1/+1 for each amplify on a 2/2. Solid draft card, average expedition card. Not really too much to say about it. It's an elf soldier, so it might fill soldier slots if you really need soldiers. It also might fill elf slots if you need elves. In either situation, okay. But yeah, I would say that the tribal part of it actually matters more than the amplify part of it. You're probably not playing this in an amplify deck and being like, yes, I got that 5/5 off my amplify. It's more likely that this card, is played in a deck that needs a bunch of soldiers, which means it's more of a strong limited card and just average expedition. But you never know. There could be very, very cheap amplifies that make Mabel Off Delete an insanely aggressive option. I think it's more likely that if it really synergizes well with soldiers or elves, that it sees a lot of play for that reason, and then amplify cards come in sort of naturally. Linax, Molten Wing. Flying when you play a weapon for a 3/3, red, green. 3/3 flyer for 3, generally a really powerful stat line. Red, green, very difficult influence cost. This is not as reliable as a Valkyrie Enforcer. When you play a weapon, Linax deals that weapon's cost in damage to an enemy. Okay, that's pretty good. That basically makes all of your weapon spells into removal, which is a fairly big deal for Valkyrie. I'd say this card is relatively powerful. I wouldn't say it's as powerful as Valkyrie Enforcer, but I could see it in Throne. Expedition wise, yeah, it's a 3/3 flyer. It's not hard to play because the previous set is really, really heavy on influence fixers, so that's going to be a big deal. Rakano Silix is in the format, so Linax Molten Wing seems very, very easy to run. So yeah, you can just throw out your weapons and put fire symbols and make this card into an absolutely wonderful red-based Valkyrie deck that will just crush everybody. The influence cost is the only restriction on it. That makes it so it's not going to be seen in as many decks, but in the decks that it's going to see play in, it's decently powerful. The question is just how many weapons are you running to support it versus how much do you just want a 3/3 flyer for 3. Okay, Shadow Sea Expedition, create and draw a treasure trove. Amplify 2, create and draw an additional treasure trove. So it's 2 to make a trove, which is very bad. If you pay 4, then you get to draw a card. If you pay 6, you get to draw 2 cards. If you pay more than that, then you start to get a lot of value. And if you can reduce the cost of the amplify and the cost of the treasure troves, then you have some card value. That's not great. Expedition probably won't play this. Throne definitely won't play this. And if you play this in Draft, you have to have a deck that really takes advantage of it with all of the different treasure trove benefits that you are trying to get. There are some cards that will reduce the cost of treasure troves. There are some cards that will reduce the cost of amplify. It's possible both of those will be in a draft set, and this will be a really fun colorless card. So yeah, there's a lot of colorless support in this format. There's just a ton of new colorless cards and cards that specifically support colorless. The colorless deck is now completely available, and honestly, it might not include Shadow Sea Expedition because this card's kind of bad. Down Dark Scrounger. When Down Dark Scrounger attacks, your spells deal +1 damage this turn. Summon, you may sacrifice another unit to draw a spell that deals damage from your void. Spell damage on attack is a useful thing here because Grenadin have a spell damage sub-theme in Draft in particular. You can sack another unit to draw a spell that deals damage from your void is decent as a summon effect because there are a lot of Grenadin that will already do that. There is in fact a 1/1 that plays Snipe. Yeah, I already played around a little bit with the Snipe deck. There is a spell damage deck that will function, and Feln's spell damage is probably going to be a thing in the format. So this is clearly a pretty strong draft card for that option. It's also one of the cheapest ways to make spells deal extra damage that we've had, so that is potentially viable for Expedition. Unlikely for Throne, but I mean with summon ability, I think it's actually pretty reasonable. You're sacking a Grenadin to get a spell that deals damage from your Void. That means that you can pick up like Channel the Tempest amongst other things. It doesn't give the card Voidbound. As a 2-cost 2/2, this card's pretty reasonable, and you don't have to sacrifice if you don't want to, so it's just a 2-cost 2/2 otherwise. So yeah, seems very good. Very powerful pig. Yeah, I would say give it like a C in Throne, because spells that deal damage is just not really a thing. Like Prodigious Sorcery is kind of a big deal, and this kind of supports that value, but like, it's just going to be okay. In Expedition, this will be a role player. In Throne, this is going to be a really powerful rare. Or in Draft, this will be a really powerful rare. Ooh, next up, Watchwing Support. When you play an attachment, the top unit or weapon of your deck gets +2/+2. Valkyrie Warp, add 2 random green cards to your market. That's unusual. I think that this card is not great, but it does make relics and attachments a lot better. The problem is you're playing a 2-cost relic to make your next relic make your next unit better. Generally, that sort of delayed gratification is not very strong in any format that is fast, anything where you have to deal with aggro, anything along those lines. This card does have Valkyrie Warp, so that's kind of a big deal, but the Valkyrie Warp ability is only for card advantage, the advantage of playing the relic. The 2 random green cards in your market could be helpful, but you also have to be able to access the green cards in your market, and you're playing a lot of like attachments and weapons in your deck and not as many units. There's a lot that has to happen for this card to be good. I think that it is pretty okay with Valkyries in Draft. I would be skeptical of it in Expedition. I would absolutely not play it in Throne. All right. Heavy Artillery. Overwhelm, Valkyrie Warp, play a 3/3 weapon on one of your units. It's a 5/1 relic weapon with Overwhelm, which is actually kind of a big deal, right? Because the last card that had Overwhelm was a 6/3 for 6. So this is pretty decently statted for a relic weapon. Like, you can actually get a surprising amount of damage out of this card. It'll kill something, it'll do splash. And then not only that, but it gives all of your weapons, all of your spells splash, which potentially gets you a lot of value through like Grenadins and other sort of scary blocker setups. The main disadvantage to this card, and the thing that makes it a little bit weaker, is that regen is a really prevalent thing in this format, and regen completely nullifies Heavy Artillery. So the Valkyrie Warp off of this is still going to be pretty strong, but if you're playing against a lot of regen cards, you're pretty dead in the water. So that's something that you got to be a little bit careful about. Still, getting the warp on this is gotta feel really good, and if you have a bunch of cards that deal damage, that also has to feel pretty good, particularly if you have some way of shutting off regen. I think this is reasonably strong. The reduced health does make it more risk than Stonescar Maul, but Stonescar Maul was always a card that died immediately anyways, so this is not like a huge change up from that, and it's a lot cheaper and a lot more effective. I think this will push through in Draft pretty commonly, and I think that Valkyrie Warp Expedition will have a lot of fun with it. Throne-wise, maybe. Probably not, but maybe. Okay, we talked about Deathwing already. We haven't talked about Pinnacle of the Reach. At the start of each player's turn, they draw an additional card. It's a Howling Mine, which is one of like the most well-known and common cards in Magic, and like also just like a pretty common card in most card games. Almost every like card game has some version of this card. This obviously benefits the opponent more than it benefits you on the turn that you play it, which tends to make it weaker. However, most decks that play cards like this tend to be able to figure out a way to get around that. This is probably not going to birth like the next like Mine Mill deck, because I don't think that Eternal will ever really allow that to happen. But this is something where basically like you're playing control, but you're playing control at like turbo speed against an opponent who is drawing way too many cards to be useful. There's a couple of other cards that support this value, so like it's got some potential. I think it's unlikely for Draft. Basically, like, you know, you're trying to build a really specific archetype with this, which maybe you can get some benefits out of, but like you lose card advantage playing it, and then your opponent gets card advantage at the start of their turn, which they can then use to crush you. Probably not a Draft card. Expedition or Throne, yeah, you got a very specific deck that's going to play this, and it's going to make everybody draw a bunch of cards and then somehow punish you for having cards in your deck. The most likely option is Maul, but there's a lot of different ways to sort of go about punishing people for having too many cards in their hand. The main one being just making them more expensive and then making yours cheaper, Distortion Orb style. Passionate Stonehammer, Flying Berserk Reckless, Summon Plunder. It's a 2/1 Valkyrie, and yeah, it's got a decent amount of different stats. The Plunder ability is really neat, the Berserk ability is really neat, it's got Reckless, but it's a flyer, it deals a lot of damage, it's good aggression, it's clearly a strong draft card. It's probably good in Expedition as well, because Flying Berserk on a 2/1 is... yeah, pretty good. I would say that this will play, and it also triggers Valkyrie Warp, so you got like a lot of different aggressive options. This is probably going to be your standard 2-drop for Valkyries for a while. Red Valkyries don't have a 2-drop yet, so this plays in Throne as well, because Red Valkyries are just going to need 2-drops. So unless there are a lot of other options in this particular setup, then yeah, this is just the card that you use to trigger Valkyrie Warp. Razorbot, 1/1 Deadly, a Grenadin Rodent. It's a spider that's also a Grenadin. That's more powerful than a spider because it's a Grenadin. That's really all I have to say about it. If you play a spider in Throne, then you'd play a Grenadin in Throne, but by and large, it's not going to be insane in Throne. Good in Expedition, good in Draft. Razorblades, deal 1 damage. Play 1/1 Razorbots with Deadly equal to the damage that Razorblades deals. Amplify 3, deal 1 damage. So, doesn't have Deadly itself, which would be kind of the thing that would make it nuts. But yeah, I mean, it'd have to be 4 at least. So you get Razorbots equal to the amount that you are dealing. So in this case, you are killing a small unit, making a 1/1 Deadly unit. If this were a fast spell, this would be a bonkers thing to do. As a slow spell, I think it's pretty good in Draft. Like creating little deadly units is generally pretty irritating, but it's not like Torrent of Spiders strong. If you pay 9 for this, kill a 3-drop and get 3 1/1 deadly units, that's pretty insane. If you pay 6 for this, kill a 2-drop or a 2 health unit and get 2 deadly units, you're probably a little ahead. And if you pay 3 for this, get something that's like a 2/1 or a 3/1 and get a single deadly unit, you're still pretty ahead. So yeah, draft-wise, this seems quite nice. I don't think you play it in any other format unless there's something that really amplifies Amplify. Otherwise, it's just not going to see a lot of play. Okay. I lost track. Nope, I didn't. Amber Lock. Summon, draw a card, pay 4, and sacrifice Amber Lock to draw a card. Whew. What do you say? We take a short break. This is about 45 minutes in. We're going to call this part 2. We'll be right back, and we will be doing we'll be doing another breakdown of the remaining cards. Be right back.